Hi, this is Lucas Greenwood. You're with me, Leather. Today I'm switching it up, and rather than doing a live session or hand history review, I'm doing a slideshow. And what I'm going to talk about today is the human element of poker. I think it's a topic that probably doesn't get enough credit, but is quite important, especially for those of you who are playing lower stakes against weaker opponents, because they are definitely giving off live tells and bet sizing tells, and not taking advantage of that is definitely a mistake. I think on a personal level, there were a lot of spots where I would rely on game theory a little too much as a crutch, particularly the bottom of ranges that were acceptable to get in under game theory. I would just grumble and stick it in because game theory says my hand is strong enough to get in, but often be disappointed with the results when I'm getting in 9s pre-flop or 10s pre-flop against a player who's either not 3-betting or 4-betting enough, and just in general not taking advantage of the information your opponents give you in hands that allow you to make better decisions, because they are giving you information on their range which allows you to make occasional hero falls and occasional big call downs and occasionally slow play hands you would normally choose to fast play. The human element, you need to remember that you're always playing against other people, and people are not robots, they are fallible. For that reason, I think it's very important to be actively looking for spots to exploit your opponents and take advantage of spots where they are either polarizing their ranges by taking certain actions that they wouldn't take with certain hands, and also understanding that people do give away timing tells as well, and weighting all of that into the total picture when you're giving somebody a range. So people give off information that is not explicitly stated in their actions. And in this instance, what I mean by their actions is whether they choose to bet, raise, check, or fold. And people still have to make those decisions, but based on their body language, their timing, and other information, you can weight the ranges accordingly, either towards the top or the bottom, or you can even make the read that they're towards the middle of the range. It does not always happen, and there are a lot of spots, particularly if you're playing against tougher opponents, where you just need to rely on what you think is the best play without much of a read. But there are definitely opportunities where you can make exploitable shoves or call downs or folds and feel fine about it because your opponent has taken action that has defined their range in such a way that you're confident they're either bluffing a lot right now, or they have they're polarized towards a very strong hand as well. So along those lines, it's important to try and understand your opponent and their thought process, which goes a little deeper than simple hand reading, because you need to try and recognize how the specific player would play the hand and which way they play their hands. For example, how often they were fast playing and how often they were slow playing, and using that to factor into the ranges. A very simple example I can think of is that there are a lot of regulars who play pretty snug against two barrels. So if I get to the river against them on a 7-8-3 Jack, King board or something, they're going to be folding a lot of their hands like nines or sixes on the turn. So it's actually not a great spot for me to be bluffing or betting thin for value, because those certain player types, at least, they're slow playing a lot of their sets and they're folding their hands that are weaker than sets in two pairs. So they just get to the river with such a strong range. It's important to remember when you're thinking about the human element and trying to make live reads on people that you need to quantify them. As I said earlier, I thought slash felt he was at the top of his range. And I think that's a perfectly reasonable statement to make. I chose to put thought slash felt because I do value intuition, and if you're an experienced player and your gut's telling you to either fold or that you want to make a big call down, and you aren't just making it up, you genuinely feel that way, and you're staring at the board for a long time, and you're just thinking, oh man, I'm pretty sure he's got the blade here. By the blade, I mean like the nuts. Don't feel bad folding that hand because game theory says you're not supposed to. So when game theory doesn't work, the first and most obvious thing is that the further from game theory optimally your opponents are playing, the more you should deviate from game theory optimal strategy. So if you're playing in a game with a bunch of fish, let's say there's one fish who min raises pre-flop and then open shoves 99 big blinds on every flop, you should probably be peeling, and he's doing it with 80% of hands or something. You should probably not be folding anything really pre-flop against him. And as stacks get deeper, you can afford to play more and more hands as well. So while that example is obviously a little silly and unrealistic, the general point stands that if you're playing against weaker opponents, you can widen your ranges, and if you're playing against tighter players, also weak, like poor players who are playing too tight, you can tighten your ranges, particularly if they're making large opens or you're on a shallow stack. Even if you're playing in a game against regulars, they are not playing game theory optimally. Potentially, if you were playing a no-limit game with Phil and Z and Hack and Sauce, they would be playing pretty close to game theory optimally, and you would need to resort to game theory in a lot of spots. But even the good regulars make mistakes. We all give off tells. I know on a personal level that when I get dealt aces or flop a set, like I still sometimes get a little excited and maybe bet too fast or show it on my face if I'm playing live. And while it doesn't happen all the time, it happens enough of the time that you should try and be aware of it the small chunk of the time it does happen, so you can take advantage of it and save money. Game theory optimal rock, paper, scissors, for those of you who don't know, suggests that you throw rock a third of the time, paper a third of the time, and scissors a third of the time, which is a strategy that can't lose money, but probably won't win very much money either. And particularly not if you're paying rake to play. So while I bring this up because the point I'm trying to get across is that there is a substantial element of poker that is a bit of a guessing game, and what you want to try and do in those spots is to guess right more often than your opponent, and the way you guess right is by being more aware of your opponent and tying his actions from start to finish, including something as innocuous as him maybe pump fake folding pre-flop, or not like I am using some live examples here, but maybe your opponent does something like snap check a turn card in a spot that it's kind of surprising, and you would expect him to think about it a little bit longer, or you just think that it could mean he's just very strong and he's just excited, or conversely, I'm not doing a very good job of explaining this right now because I'm basically saying it could mean all three things if he snap checks, which is partially true. And the point I guess I'm trying to get at is that the human element is about trying to decipher which of those three, what their actions mean, based on understanding the specific player and the specific situation. In theory, game theory always works. In practice, it does not. And I point this out just because there are spots, and this I'm drilling this home quite a bit, but the point is that there are spots where in practice, in game, because there's real money on the line and because your opponent needs to make a decision based on a clock, where they will make a decision that alters their timing. And going back to the second point, that since your opponents are not playing game theory optimally, you don't need to play game theory optimally either. And knowing personally, there were spots where I have had hands and my thought is I need to call this hand because game theory dictates it's a call. And even though I'm like, well, I'm not sure because I think this guy's bluffing here 80% of the time, I just really confident he has it, and you time bank down to 1 second or whatever and make the call and get shown the nuts. And I always feel stupid in those spots because my instinct was right, my read was right, and then you choose to make a different decision based on theory, which has nothing to do with the actual practical hand being played. In practice, in my opinion, you play optimally by playing each hand in a vacuum, which might sound off, and I think some players will disagree with this, but I'm pretty confident in what I'm saying here because you don't want to be making any negative EV decisions in any poker game, and that means that when you can weight people towards a certain part of the range, either the top, bottom, or middle, you should use that information to make your decisions correctly by folding the middle when you expect them to be at the top and calling the middle when you expect them to be near the bottom. Lastly, I do want to point this out, that the best vacuum decision often will be equal to the best game theory decision. So it is very important to understand game theory because in probably 95% of situations it will guide you correctly, but what I'm trying to talk about here with the 5% of hands where it won't, and using that information to play exploitatively in certain spots when you deem it to be correct. So why you should play exploitatively? The first reason is your opponent doesn't know your cards and that you are playing each hand in a vacuum. So if my opponent triple barrels me on and I have a hand, a strong hand in my range, say something like top pair and middle pair, or top pair and bottom pair by the river, and I'm confident that he's value betting, and I know that I'm behind something like 70% of his value bets, so I decide I need to fold my hand. My opponent doesn't know what I'm folding. As far as he knows, I could be folding second pair or top pair or no kicker. So it doesn't matter that I'm making a quote-unquote exploitable fold if my opponent doesn't know I'm making an exploitable fold. The second thing is that nobody is dealt a range of cards. You use a range as a heuristic to guide your hand reading process, but nobody is ever dealt more than 2 cards in Hold'em or 4 cards in Omaha, unless you're playing 5-card Omaha. But for that reason, what you want to try and do is narrow your opponent's range as much as you can, and the weaker your opponent is, the more you can come closer to guessing their exact 2 cards, and allow yourself to then play close to perfectly on the river, or closer to perfectly on turn and river spots. I'm going to give a simple example of a hand. Bajoure's under the gun, big blind calls, you see bet Jack 9-2, the turn is a 4, it goes check check, and the river is a 2 and your opponent bets. Now this is a spot where most of your opponent's value bets will be between a pair of 9s and a pair of jacks. If he's good, he's value betting his strong 9s and probably his weak 9s as well, and definitely any jack. Now on the river, you're in a spot where occasionally you probably should have a jack, your jack 10 or queen jack, that you check back on the turn so you can call a river bet with it. But for a lot of your range, say any ace high or any pair worse than a 9, you beat all of his bluffs, being king queen, queen 10, maybe 10-8, and you lose to all his value bets. So what you should be doing in this spot, particularly with any hand worse than a 9, is for some players you're probably correct to fold every time if they aren't bluffing enough. If you ever read on them that they say don't bluff dry runouts because they don't expect to have enough fold equity. But the point I'm getting at is if you get to this river here with ace 3 suited or pocket 6s, I don't think it matters too much. I don't expect to get floated on this flop by ace high very often. And I think if your opponent's bluffing, his most likely hand is king high, queen high, or maybe 10 high. So whether to call ace high or pocket 6s on the river here is, in my eyes, if you think it's profitable to call pocket 6s on this spot, then you should also be calling ace high, which comes down to often live reads, timing tells, and bet sizing tells, because they do exist, and you want to try and be on top of that, particularly in a live setting where you can more accurately gauge it because you have more information available to you. You won't always be able to guess right, and you certainly won't always be able to know what cards your opponent have, but in those spots you should try and be thinking more about, based on how your opponent played the hand, and not just his actions but his body language and timing as well, where in his range he is likely to be. And to be honest, you won't always be able to come up with an answer, but sometimes you will, and those times where you can confidently make your decision because of the live reads and timing tells you get are very important. It's also important to remember that stakes and settings affect people's ranges. If a 2-4 reg is taking a shot at a 50-100 game because a fish is playing in it and you're playing in the 50-100 game, you should probably know that he's going to be playing tighter in a lot of spots. If you're playing an MTT and you're at the final table of the Sunday Million, you should, and you know one of the players like won a $2 satellite in, you should probably expect them to be playing a little tighter, and that works both ways. If you're playing a 500 no limit game and there's some high stakes fish, Gila Liberté is sitting at your 500 no limit game, I wouldn't be looking to fold very many hands to him, because you have to assume that he's probably playing a bit looser and spazzier than he would normally. So capitalizing on exploitive situations can make you a lot of money, and it's important to be looking out for them, although they are not always hiding in plain sight and can be difficult to find. I'm going to give an example from a hand I played a while ago at Zoom, where I opened under the gun with pocket 5, 6-handed. The small blind 200 big blinds deep called, and the flop was ace-7-5 rainbow, and we're 200 blinds deep, and he check raised me, and I called, and the turn was a brick, and he bet, and I called, and the river was a brick, and he bet again fairly large. And my read on this player was that he wouldn't be playing ace-7 suited like that pre-flop. I think he would fold it, and he wouldn't be playing top pair like that for value post-flop. And I was also pretty confident that he wasn't bluffing, because I thought my range was uncapped, and it would be sort of a strange spot for him to be bluffing. I did end up calling because I had a set, and he showed me pocket 7s, and without trying to sound like a bad beat story, I think it's a spot where in that moment, is that opponent balanced? Probably not. He's probably just thinking I have 3 7s and I want to play a large pot with it. And from my perspective, he wouldn't have played aces like that, I don't think, although that matters. And I mean, him playing aces like that would make it more of a fold. And I didn't think he would play a 7 suited pre-flop, and it's fairly likely he just had exactly pocket 7s, which is a hand he would not fold pre-flop, and a hand that will make sense for him to play like that. And while wasn't too upset at myself for making the call, I think that was a spot where I could have found a big laydown and didn't make it. But just because it's exploitive doesn't mean it's bad if I'm trying to take advantage of my opponent, who I don't think is necessarily balanced in that spot. And from playing with him, didn't have much of a check raise bluffing range, and his most likely value hand would be 3 7s. So I would be okay folding that, and if I did correctly fold it, I'm making 50 big blinds or 60 big blinds, or saving, I guess, not making, but penny save is a penny earned, by making that laydown. The last thing I want to add is that the stronger your opponent is, the fewer exploitive opportunities there are that arise, and the more you do kind of need to resort to game theory defaults and rely on them bluffing more often, and just recognizing that they can play tricks on you with live reads and timing tells and bet sizing. With that said, I'm going to talk about this a bit. Live reads and timing tells. Body language does not lie usually. Against very strong players and experienced players, they're certainly capable of making false tells, but the point here is that body language is pretty consistent, and it's much harder to disguise your body language than most people think. So for that reason, if someone's body language is telling you something, it's normally true. If you're talking about high stakes regulars who high stakes poker players presumably would be better at controlling their body language than most, so it's obviously harder to pick up a read on it, but particularly against weaker players, they will often give off a lot of information about their hand just based on the way they're acting or their timing, particularly in a live setting. Some reads very quick that they don't always hold, but they're often true. In general, I would say fast is strong. People value their money. No one likes losing money. And if someone's quickly shoveling their money into the pot, it's often because they have a very strong hand and they're excited about it. It doesn't hold true in all cases, but in a lot of spots it's true, particularly in MTTs in certain spots where, say, under the gun shoves and middle position just insta calls or insta rejams. They have a hand that they weren't really thinking about folding or thinking about another option with, which tells you a lot and often means strength. It's important to weight your reads appropriately, and I'm going to use two examples. The first is a hand I played in the PCA main event maybe 4 years ago, where I raised under the gun 2 with ace jack off, and a nervous older guy on the button jammed 20 big blinds, and I was sitting there, and I wasn't as strong in my fundamentals as I am now, and I just remember looking at the guy and just thinking, he's really nervous, he's very uncomfortable, he doesn't like his hand. I have ace jack and it's 20 big blinds, and I know he doesn't like his hand because he's really not comfortable with it. And I ended up sticking it in, and the results aren't good for me. That he had ace queen off and I lost and got it in really bad. I bring that up because, as I say, weight your reads appropriately. That ace jack off just isn't a hand I should be getting in there. It's just not a good play. Not because he had ace queen, but even ranging him towards the bottom of his range, I don't expect him to be shoving wide enough there against an early position open for ace jack off to be a call. I think it's a spot where ace queen is a hand that makes a lot of sense for him to have. I wouldn't be surprised if he had ace jack suited or 8s or 9s, but it's a good example of when kind of live reads can go wrong, because you let the live read supersede the fundamentals of the hand. Another one I have is I was playing a 55 freeze out online. The hijack raises and I have 7 in the big blind with 20 bigs. Now, in this spot, my mouse was actually out of batteries, so I was going to my kitchen, getting batteries, putting them in the mouse to replace the old ones. Meanwhile, my time bank's ticking down, but I had about 90 seconds in my bank, so I wasn't too worried. After spending about 45 seconds in the bank, I get my mouse back, and I shove 7s because I think it's for 20 big blinds, because I think it's correct. And I got insta-called by the hijack with ace-5 off, who's regular, which is obviously a really bad call, and I suspect he made it because he thought I was tanking so long, and why would I be tanking so long? Unless I was making a really thin reshove with 8-9 suited or 9-10 suited or something like that. So it's important while you should be looking for live reads and timing tells and the like, that they shouldn't cause you to make plays like that which dramatically fall out of what's acceptable. Live reads do follow a logic though, and if you have live reads during the hand and they're going to influence your decision, you should be able to explain them. It can even be like he looked really uncomfortable, or he just snap shoved the river for 2x pot and I knew he had to have a really big hand. But they follow a logic and not some strange voodoo, and I think that's important to remember. The other thing I'm going to say is, if you want to start using this stuff in your games, you need to trust your instincts and don't outthink yourself and don't look for false patterns. It's really easy to play a hand and tell yourself, oh, I think he's bluffing here because of this, this, and this, and then you call and you get shown the nuts and you go, oh. If you have a live read on a situation where you want to make a play that doesn't fit normally into your overall game plan, you shouldn't need to convince yourself it's a good play. You should just sort of know it, which sounds obviously easier said than done. But the point I'm making, I guess, is that these situations don't come up very often, and you shouldn't try and talk yourself into them. You should recognize them when they come up and then take advantage of them, which is different. I'm going to tell another story about live reads gone wrong. I don't actually remember the exact action on this hand, but I was playing a 5K at the PCA, and I got Jack 6 of hearts in, or I had Jack 6 of hearts on the river, which was a flush, and my opponent bet, and I shoved, and he was sitting there tanking for quite a long time, and he was sort of muttering him to himself like, "Oh, I like how can you have it?" And he wasn't thinking about the hand well. Obviously, it's always fairly easy to have a flush if you get to the river and there's a flush draw fields. And after a long time in the tank, I kind of was thinking to myself, I think this guy wants to call me, but he needs a reason to call me. And I had a bottle of water beside me on the floor, and I just kind of like reached down and picked up the bottle of water and took a big swig. And within 10 or 15 seconds of me doing that, he goes, I call, and I win. I know it might sound like the two events aren't related, but being there live, I'm pretty confident that if I didn't take that swig of water, I wouldn't have got called. And while it's very innocuous, I guess it's a good example of what not to do, where someone taking a drink of water isn't really indicative of anything other than they're thirsty. Bet sizing tells. So the first one I'm going to talk about, and it's probably the one online I see the most today, is people inducing when they aren't folding. So it goes like raise 3-bet, and someone called 4-bets off a 20 big blind stack or something. Or raise 3-bet and the opener called 4-bets off a 25 big blind stack, trying to make it look like he's folding when he obviously is not. You need to know your opponents here, because a few things to point out. One is with certain hands, it's not a good play to be doing that. Like if I have ace king there and I'm kicking it back on someone and they are correct to call with a ton of hands getting really good pot odds. If I have aces or kings, they are not correct. So if you need to assume your opponent is smart enough to realize that. But it is definitely a tell, and not for everyone. I would watch out against strong players, because strong players will do that with the whole value range. So you definitely don't want to be making any big hero folds with like jacks or tens when they could be clicking it back on you with ace king. I'm going to use an example from a tournament here as bet sizing tells. So hijack raises button, or hijack raises and then the button off a 16 big blind stack clicks it back, and we have ace queen off in the big blind. I think that's a spot where if the button shoved, I would be calling or rejamming all day. But there's a click it back. There's a lot of players I would fold ace queen off there, because they are representing a very different range from when they shove, even if they don't realize it. Another example of bet sizing tells I'm going to bring up is small river bets, where people size their bet in such a way that they wouldn't actually bet that small when they're bluffing. Again, it's really important to recognize who you're playing against, because if you start folding a bunch of hands to an 8th part river bet, suddenly it's not such a bad bluff. But there are players who are exploitable in their bet sizing, and when they're betting that small, it's for value 95% of the time, so unless you're getting 20 to 1, you need to be laying it down. Another thing I'm going to talk about for bet sizing tells is oval bets, particularly small oval bets. If there was 1,000 chips in the pot and someone bets 1,100, I'm calling 1,100 to win 3,100, and if they bet 900, I'm calling 900 to win 2,900. So I don't actually, from a mathematical standpoint, need to be right that much more often, but the fact that my opponent is choosing to overbet and like choosing to type in an overbet is very relevant information, and there's a lot of players weighted much more heavily towards value. So first, I would recommend watching your own game to avoid these mistakes. I wouldn't, if you aren't regularly overbetting and you get to the river with a strong hand, there's no need to overbet. And if you do get to the river with a really strong hand and want to overbet, at least make it like double the pot, so the payoff is there when you get called. But if you're just betting like 1.1x pot as a slight overbet, which I think makes your hand look quite a bit stronger, and versus a lot of players means they're playing a much stronger range, to only get a few more chips, like 30% more chips than an 80% pot bet, I don't think it's a good play. And the earlier examples, again, it's really important to, when you're playing, to tie this all back into the human element, recognize your own actions and what you're representing when you're playing, and actually think about what other hands you would play like that and how you would play them. While I said earlier in the video that you aren't playing a range, which is true, you only get dealt 2 cards, so you're only playing those 2 cards, you can act like you're playing a range. So it's really important when you're choosing your bet sizing and your timing, you think it through and try and think about the other hands you would play like that and what size and timing you would take with them, as to avoid being exploitable by giving away information in your bet sizing and timing. That's the end of the slideshow. I think I'm interested to see how it goes. This is an experiment for me, and I hope I don't get booed out of the building or anything, but I think this stuff isn't talked about enough, and focusing on your own sizing and timing to avoid being exploitable, I think, is a very important element to improving your game as a poker player, and trying to be aware of your opponent's sizing and timing and using it against them when they make mistakes is equally important, particularly against weaker players who their timing and sizing means a lot more than strong players. Thanks again. I look forward to seeing the comments on this one. This is Luke Greenwood signing off for Run It Once. Bye.